My name is Zbigniew Brzezinski, Crimean Tatar Research and Information Center. Professor Brzezinski, several months ago you met with our Crimean Tatar leader, Mustafa Dzhemilev, and I'm sure he briefed you on the status of the Crimean Tatars in Crimea. I asked this question to Deputy Foreign Minister this morning, but I would like to ask you also. Given the Russian influence in Crimea, do you think that Ukraine has enough leverage, enough control of Crimea to resolve the Crimean Tatar problem? Does Ukraine have the political will to resolve the Crimean Tatar problem?
I think the honest answer is I don't know. That is the honest answer. I think there's a predisposition among many Ukrainians to try to resolve this problem. But whether they have sufficient political will, which would include having to antagonize the Russian-speaking population in Crimea, but also quite a few of the Ukrainians in Crimea, that this may be, in the initial phase, too much for some of them to undertake. Nonetheless, I do have a sense that there is a growing consensus in Ukraine that the era of injustice must not only be forgotten, but to the extent possible, corrective measures within practical limits have to be undertaken. This is a process which has taken place in Central Europe over the last 20 years, and in every case it's terribly difficult, because correcting the past often means also imposing some consequences for people who are not directly responsible for what happened in the past, but were the indirect beneficiaries of what happened in the past. And that vastly complicates the resolution of such issues. Yes?
Good afternoon. Atul Singh, founder and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer, a new journal on global issues we launched last week. My question is this. You said, correct me if I'm wrong, that internal factors in Ukraine and Russia will interplay with each other. Was that a comment you did make, or am I misconstruing you?
You're essentially correct. Okay.
So I understand internal factors in Russia having an impact on Ukraine because of size, because of other factors. Russia can interfere with Ukraine in a deliberate and tangible way. How do you see internal factors in Ukraine playing out in Russia? If you could expand on that, that'd be very kind.
Well, I can expand on it by citing what I once said, that historically, Ukraine, the ancient Rus, is Russia's older brother. In Russian historiography, the Russians like to say that the Russians are the older brother of the Ukrainians. But when one speaks historically, that's not the case. But also when one speaks politically, it's not the case. Because the performance of independent Ukraine politically over the last 20 years has been more mature than Russian performance. In that sense, the Ukrainians are also the older brothers of the nascent democracy in Russia. They're providing an example that in the post-Soviet context, in which there hasn't been, for a very long time, if ever, an institutionalized democratic tradition, it is possible to nurture democracy and to consistently practice it. And that's something of which the Ukrainians ought to be very proud. And if they're proud of it, they ought to be especially alert to the negative consequences of political repression. And political repression can be direct, or it can be indirect. It can be excused by other allegations. But if the effect is political repression psychologically and politically, it is political repression. And I think on that issue, it is in Ukraine's own interest to be unambiguous in drawing the line and in rejecting the settling of political scores by repression or intimidation. Yes?
My name is Irina Khaluba. I work for Radio Liberty. It sounds to me, Dr. Brzezinski, that you want Ukraine to save Russia from itself or from its evil sort of deeds and intentions. I would like to ask you to elaborate on that a little bit. How can we help them?
Well, I just did, I think, in part, in the last answer. But I don't argue that Ukraine is going to save Russia. I do make the argument that Ukraine can help Russia save itself. It's a subtle difference, but sometimes subtlety is the essence of a point.
Tatiana Cockridge, Voice of America. During this conference and in your speech, you were talking mostly about the internal developments in Ukraine, but what is about external developments in the world around Ukraine? For example, such trends as U.S. is withdrawing from Afghanistan and Iraq, hence is becoming less dependent on Russia for passage of troops, maybe some other trends which are going on globally. In other words, is it a good time for development of the U.S.-Ukrainian relationship? Is it a good timing? Is it a good situation externally?
I would say on the whole it is, because the trends you talk about all reflect the decline in the homogeneity of blocs or coalitions or entities. And some of that decline is even negative. For example, I personally regret the fact that Europe is becoming less homogeneous politically than it could be or should be by now. But nonetheless, in that context, by and large, it creates more openness for individual countries which have a sense of national pride, which have a sense of their potential regional role. And let's face it, Ukraine is an important European country. After Russia, it is the largest country territorially in Europe. And it is a country of 45 million people or so. So it is a country that has every potential reason and motive to assert as much of its autonomy and independence. And I use the word autonomy because every country, to some extent, has to take into account other countries' interests. And in doing so, contributes in a way to a more healthy environment. I think the fact that right now there's also an improvement in the American-Russian relationship is in that sense felicitous. The fact that the Poles are seeking reconciliation with the Russians and the Russians are seeking reconciliation with the Poles, even though it's going rather with difficulty, but it is moving forward, is again a good symptom. I think the fact that the Ukrainian-Polish reconciliation is much more a reality than Russian-Polish reconciliation. That too enlarges the Ukrainian options. I would think that if I were a Ukrainian, I would be very interested in developing much closer relations with Turkey, which is playing an increasingly important regional role. And it makes sense for the Ukrainians, who geographically have had all sorts of connections across the Black Sea, to have a closer relationship with Turkey. So intelligent, creative diplomacy can be, I think, very usefully applied in this setting as you described.
On the improved relation between Ukraine and Poland, I'm wearing my Euro 2012 pin, which underlines everybody's hopes that we will have a successful Euro Cup next year, hosted by the two countries together. But a symbol of the cooperation.
Well, I could be wearing my boutonniere here, the Ukrainian decoration that I received, which I'm prepared to triangulate. I got it as an American official, but given my name, probably most Ukrainians suspect I'm also in part Polish.
They like it. Next question.
Okay, George Washington University. Dr. Brzezinski, how does Belarus figure in the Ukrainian stakes of foreign policy, considering the strained relationship between Belarus and Moscow recently?
Well, it's a messy picture, quite clearly, because of the messy political situation in Belarus. It's a bizarre situation in many respects. Because on the one hand, it's not maybe so much Belarus as President Lukashenko, who is asserting his autonomy by repressing his country. And it's, I don't think, a long-term constructive solution. But from the Ukrainian point of view, I would guess it's an issue that the Ukrainians must be watching carefully, but probably with prudent self-restraint insofar as any direct involvement is concerned. They're really not in a position to either affect what happens in Belarus, nor significantly to affect what happens between Belarus and Russia. So in that sense, there's more of a responsibility resting on the European Union, and particularly on that cluster of countries closer to the east, which includes not only countries immediately on the border, such as Poland, Lithuania, the Baltics more generally, but for example Sweden, which is taking a very active interest in the Belarusian problem. And I think that is probably a sensible division of labor.
Zbig, since Belarus has come up, and I don't know if you've gotten into this aspect of it, but there was some discussion this morning of the new customs union that Russia has been forging with Belarus and Kazakhstan, and whether Ukraine, common view this morning was Ukraine was not thinking of becoming a member, but finding some association with that grouping, and how that would relate to their focus on joining the European Union common market, maybe the EU itself over time. Any observations on whether you think that would create a major tension, or again add to the appearance of possible inconsistency that would derail the main objective?
I'm not enough of an expert to give you a clear-cut answer, so let me simply say this. I think the EU ought to watch that very carefully and to be really quite strict in its application of its own perception of the reality involved. In other words, I think it would be unwise for the EU to sort of try to split the difference, accommodate, if in fact it thinks that some of the special arrangements that are being contemplated, in fact, do injustice, do violate the basic premises of closer Ukraine-EU relationship. I think that they feel that way, they ought to draw the line way ahead of the game, because otherwise it becomes a sliding platform, and one can then go too far and in the end lose the vote. That is to say, really forfeit the opportunity of becoming associated with the EU.
James Sherman. I don't have a question. I really want to support and re-emphasize the fundamental point you made about the equation between Ukraine and Russia. If Ukrainians, who are seen in the Russian mind as a branch of the Russian people, are able to adopt the standards and values of the European Union and succeed at European integration, then this sends a message not only to the Russian elite but to ordinary Russians, which is revolutionary, because it demolishes the view that there is some distinctive East Slavic way of development and that we cannot do this, and exposes the fact that the problem is one, instead, of policy, political systems, and institutions. So I think this is an extremely valuable point, but I trust you would agree it still has to happen. And whatever might happen, I think a lot of us were quite right to emphasize this morning why it isn't happening yet. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I, obviously agree with what you said. I would merely reiterate the point I made earlier. I think the next 5 years are going to be quite critical. I think the trend is more positive than one would have expected. I think the inclination of the Ukrainians to pursue their own nationhood in a manner of their choice and through an association with Europe has some vitality. But there are some contradictions between external policy and domestic policy in Ukraine, which could become ominous if the latter became the dominant. And also there is some uncertainty as to what kind of Russia we're going to have in the near future. I think in the long run, I'm personally convinced that Russia has no choice. In the long run, Russia does not have a choice. But there are lots of important Russians who are in a much better position to influence Russia than I, who have a different view. And I think they may be tempted in the near future to still pursue a game which is partially nostalgia, which is partially great power chauvinism, which is partially false pride, which is partially an underestimation of the dangers that Russia faces domestically and internationally, and therefore pursue a policy that could be negative in its essence. And that could, combined with the repressive balance in Ukraine have rather ominous consequences for Ukraine.
Let me ask two related questions, Zbig, that also came up prominently in the discussion this morning. There was a lot of commentary, of course, about corruption in Ukraine. But one school of thought argued that corruption was really more a symptom of a concentration of power within the country than a problem per se. And the question there is, do you see a trend toward increased concentration of power within the country? And if so, how much does that add to the possible ominous outcome? Related to that, there was an argument from some folks this morning that the concentration of power that seems to be occurring is due to some fundamental flaws in the Ukrainian political and even constitutional system. A lack of checks and balances within the system of government that has evolved over these 20 years, so that there's an absence of the kind of competing power centers that would be normal in a society headed toward democracy, and therefore require some rather fundamental changes in the system of government that we're seeing in Ukraine before it can really get on track. You are an eminent and extremely close student of the evolution of other post-communist societies, including on variables of that type. Share with us your assessment of where Ukraine stands on those variables, what maybe it could learn from the evolution of other post-communist transformations, and kind of what course might it chart to try to take the next step in the evolution toward a democratic system.
Well, that's a very complex issue, and I'm not sure I have any sort of grand theory or remedy to offer. I do have one point to make, however. Ukrainian corruption is not Ukrainian corruption. It's post-Soviet corruption. Yeah, I think that's a very important point. I don't think there's anything, so to speak, culturally typical about Ukrainian corruption. As I don't think there's any corruption is culturally Russian. It's the cumulative effect of a system that over time bred corruption when it shifted from fanaticism to self-interest. And fanaticism was the first phase of the Bolshevik Revolution, and then after a while it became self-interest. And that corruption in turn also inherited some of the corruption in Tsarist era. We're dealing with a society of 45 million people, which for the last hundreds and hundreds of years was part of a larger entity in which certain patterns of conduct were institutionalized and became pervasive. What I think is more specific to our time is that in this setting, not of Ukrainian corruption, but of post-Soviet corruption, in Ukraine, part of the elite that can be viewed as particularly susceptible to corruption, and it is usually identified, Donetsk, Dnipropetrovsk, has the attitude, well, we have the right to steal in Kiev, and not those guys in Moscow, who had the right for centuries. But that doesn't make it a Ukrainian corruption. It merely makes it like a gang warfare. This is my sphere and this is your sphere. And the guys in Moscow say, well, we don't want you to be in a separate sphere, we'd like you to be back. And the guys over there say, no, this is ours. And then nationalism begins to enter it. And as nationalism begins to enter into it, you begin to play the international game. As you begin to play the international game, international standards begin to flow in. And in a lesser degree, much lesser degree, that's been the experience of Central Europe also. And their corruption, yes, was probably more their own, but it was also the product of, 40, 50 years of Soviet control. And then, since it was shorter and briefer, and there was more nationalism, it was somewhat easier to get rid of, but not yet entirely. Look at the Czech Republic, which had a great democratic tradition ever since 1990. It is probably much more corrupt today than Poland. The Poles are much more nationalistic, though. So maybe some of their anti-corruption attitude is precisely to show they're different. That's corrupt. Well, I'm, of course, joking partially, but there may be something to that, kind of a sense of, we're going to show, we're going to be the success story in this part of the region. Well, if Poland can be the success story in Central Europe, Ukraine can be the success story in the former Soviet Union.
Yes.
Rich Kosrich, former U.S. ambassador to Azerbaijan and now George Mason University. Dr. Brzezinski, you mentioned Turkey-Ukrainian connections geographically. As I thought about it, they share a couple of other things in common as well. One being transit hubs for energy, both from Russia and certainly in the case of Turkey, from the Caspian region into Europe. Secondly, they both share the status of being the two major European countries outside of the EU who have varying degrees of prospects, of which we talked this morning about in Ukraine's case of joining the EU. But maybe you could talk a little bit about Turkey's role in this whole complex of issues that we're looking at, because of the shifts that have obviously gone on in terms of Turkey's own development, but now developments elsewhere in the greater Middle East. Sorry, Fred, I'm hijacking the meeting to get us off in a different direction, but since you raised it, Dr. Brzezinski, I appreciate your views.
Well, you have every reason to raise it because you've done so much to make sure that Azerbaijan and so forth are successful. And you make a very important point. I think Turkey is an interesting example of how an intelligent foreign policy, which involves a great deal of accommodation with the Russians, and all sorts of deals which sometimes are troubling to us. For example, it complicates the Nabucco aspects, even though by and large the Turks are still more for Nabucco than for some other alternatives. It illustrates the point that it is possible to have an intelligent policy towards Russia without forsaking cool-headed national interest in terms of the longer run. Because the Turks at the same time are helping, in effect, without being boisterous about it, to consolidate independence of Azerbaijan and of Georgia, and thereby making it possible for Europe to have alternative access to the Caspian and beyond. And probably before too long, too many energy will be flowing via Azerbaijan and Georgia and Turkey to Europe. And in a sense, Ukraine has a similar interest. And there's no doubt that at some point, from the Ukraine point of view, some sort of enhanced energy relationship with those countries is in Ukraine's interest. Diversification is always a good idea for any country that wishes to have the greatest degree of choice for itself, and therefore independence. So I think here is another dimension of the potential Ukraine and Turkish relationship that is beneficial, in fact, to both. I also don't think it's entirely an accident, although that reflected a very specific policy choice which would not be appropriate anymore, but which was nonetheless an important signal that Ukraine was deeply engaged in helping Georgia resist Russia. And that, in a way, was a signal of a kind of an instinctive reaction, which reflects the realization that Ukrainian interests have to be seen in a broad perspective and not purely in a bilateral framework, that is to say, of their relationship with Russia. That is already, I think, being changed precisely by the importance attached to a parallel and increasingly important relationship with the EU, and therefore with some of the individual countries of the EU.
Zbig, since the Turkey analogies come up, put yourself in Brussels for a moment and think of yourself as the National Security Advisor or the Foreign Minister of the EU. Would you be more forthcoming in offering to Ukraine eventual membership as part of the attraction to resolve any dilemmas they have in the Western direction and hold out that very major prize which seemingly Ukraine would like, but so far at least has not really been offered?
Well, it hasn't been offered, but it hasn't been denied either. I think the position of the EU, and correct me if I'm misstating it, is that the relationship has to be developed. and it's a dynamic relationship. So presumably, it is something that is moving towards something, and ultimately, especially since the Ukrainians are emphasizing that that is their vector, it means membership in the EU. But to answer your question more specifically, I would say absolutely. I would favor saying to the Ukrainians, and in fact, I think it's kind of implicit, but maybe explicit would be preferable. Anytime you want to be members, we want you to be a member. But you have to meet all of the conditions, all of the chapters. I don't think there ought to be any sort of special leeway for individual countries. The standards for you are lower than for that country. They're higher for that country than for that country. No, that applies to Ukraine. It certainly applies to Turkey. Although here I think the problem is that the Europeans are dragging their feet on the chapters, not the Turks. And with the Ukrainians, some of the reservations that have been expressed, particularly by the French and the Germans, who have discovered all of a sudden a very intense passion for the traditions of Christianity and so forth, as the grounds for excluding perhaps the Turks, would not be applicable to the Ukrainians, because they too are Christians. Yes?
Yes, just a final question, since we're moving geographically, and with the rise of the People's Republic as a global force in international relations. The recent visit of Hu Jintao and Yanukovych's visit to Beijing signal, I think, a reanimation of that relationship. How do you see that relationship playing out? What do you see China's interests in the geopolitical interests in Ukraine vis-a-vis its broader relationship with Russia? How do you see it evolving in the coming decades?
At this stage, I don't think China has a geopolitical interest in Ukraine. China has a geopolitical interest in Kazakhstan. But I think it has an economic interest in Ukraine. And of course, over time, that can become a political and geopolitical interest. But at this stage, I think China is rather deliberately enhancing its access to Central Asia, exploiting the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which the Russians initiated, thinking that it would limit the independence of Central Asia, and are belatedly discovering that it has opened the doors of Central Asia to China. And I think they ruled the day when they made that initiative. And the Chinese are playing that extremely well, both economically and geopolitically. With Ukraine, I think they are simply taking advantage of that Ukraine needs markets, China wants markets. I wouldn't be surprised if the Chinese were very interested in helping the Ukrainians to develop agriculture, not out of charity, but out of self-interest. And I think that there might be a very meaningful meshing of respective economic interests. And that, in turn, of course, has all sorts of political consequences, which will then grow. And in that respect, for example, I think Ukraine probably is more interesting to China than Poland. Even though, of course, the EU is infinitely more important as a whole. But Poland is only one of 6 more important countries in the EU. So I think the Russian move towards Ukraine is a sensible one. I think the Ukrainians are sensible in taking advantage of it. My guess is that at this stage the Russians are not worried about it politically, whereas my sense is that with some justification they're becoming worried about what is happening.
Zbig, maybe final question. We've talked about Europe's attitude toward Ukraine, China a little bit, Russia a lot, U.S. a little. A topic that came up again in our discussions this morning: how much can external influence, pressure, encouragement affect the outcome of the internal debates in Ukraine? Every country is somewhat susceptible to outside influences, but it differs a lot from country to country, from time to time. Given this possible tension we talked about, the internal evolution in potentially ominous direction versus laudable external goals, what's your sense as to how much the outside situation, and treaties may, at the end of the day, affect what happens within Ukraine itself.
Well, that depends to some extent on the level of priority the sort of dominant political class in Ukraine assigns to the enhancement and preservation of the independent state. It's hard to judge, but I think on balance, by virtue of being that elite, they have to assign some relatively high importance to it. And in that sense, the position of the United States and of the EU is obviously quite important, even though maybe not as immediately impacting as, of course, of Russia. But, of course, it has limits. But there's something else which is peculiar here, which I think is worth mentioning. In some respects, there is a parallel here between Ukraine and Israel. That is to say, Israel has a certain inherent strategic orientation. But if the American Jewish community were to disassociate itself in some significant fashion with a prevailing Israeli government, right now, for example, a very conservative one, a very right-wing one, it would have a significant impact on Israel's own policy. I suspect that the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada and in the United States is not insignificant in that respect. It's not maybe as decisive as the Jewish community would be in Israel, but it's not insignificant. Because, for one thing, the whole notion of Ukrainian independent statehood was nurtured for decades outside Ukraine, in the diaspora. And that is where the spirit was preserved. And that was in turn nurtured, particularly the Ukrainians in Western Ukraine, then increasingly in Central Ukraine, and so forth. That is an additional factor which plays a role here. So I think since that diaspora is located in the Western Hemisphere, in the United States, in the Atlantic community, it enhances, to some degree, the American role. I don't want to overplay this. It's not quite on the same level as, let's say, the importance of the Jewish community to the internal outlook of Israel. But it is of some importance, more so than in the case of many other countries. And I think all of that, in my judgment, progressively reinforces the durability of what has existed for 20 years. 20 years is a long time in the psychology of a lot of people. Because 20 years shapes basically the outlook of anyone in Ukraine who was at least 10 to 15 years old when the country became independent. So that's an increasingly significant number. And then, of course, all the other factors we talked about come into play. But all of them cumulatively, in my judgment, allow one some kind of responsible, controlled optimism regarding prospects, with clarity about our own attitude towards this positive and negative, and no hesitation in being explicit about it, in talking to those that we value in Ukraine, given the fact that we think the Ukraine that is genuinely self-defined and independent can help Europe be a much healthier place in the larger dimension to which I made reference in my earlier comments.
Zbig, thank you enormously